Hello. It's a pleasure to be able to be here today to speak with all of you about some of my research. So the story that I wanted to tell today starts with a duck. Actually, it starts with a duck hunting trip, a trip that many of you, I'm sure, know about. And that's a trip that Dick Cheney and Chief Justice Scalia took together, among others. And many people were concerned about this trip, not because they were concerned for the safety of Cheney's dog hunting partners. that actually came later. At this point, they had a different concern. And the concern had to do with the fact that Chief Justice Scalia would soon be sitting on a case in which Cheney had some financial interests. And Cheney had funded Scalia's private jet flight to this duck hunting excursion, and the two of them also were friends. And some people were very concerned about whether Scalia would be able to be objective when sitting on this case as a result. Particularly people on the left were quite concerned about this. So for example, E.J. Dionne, who sort of asked whether a rational person could possibly doubt that Scalia would be biased by this friendship. So what was interesting to me was that at the same time that the public, and particularly those on the left, were sort of concerned about the possibility of Scalia being biased to the point where they felt that it was sort of not possible that he could be otherwise, that he himself actually did quite feel otherwise. So of course the criterion here for recusal would be if one's impartiality might be reasonably questioned, and Scalia felt that it was absurd to think that would be the case for himself. So he thought that so just as many in the public believed that it was quite obvious and to be taken for granted that he couldn't be other than biased as a result of this relationship, he felt that it was quite obvious that he couldn't otherwise then be objective, that in fact he was a Supreme Court justice and that's what he was being paid to be. And of course, this isn't the only time where people have been concerned about the possibility of bias on the part of Supreme Court justices. In the Bush versus Gore case, people worried about it again, and there people's concerns had something more to do with ideological bias and the idea that those sitting on the case would be biased by ideology as opposed to, for example, in this case where people were concerned about the biasing effects of friendship and self-interest. And my point here actually is not about Supreme Court justices per se, and it's certainly not about who's right and who's wrong in the beliefs that are shown above, but rather it's about this asymmetry in perceptions of bias, whereby people tend to readily see bias in others at the same time that they tend to view themselves as being objective. And this isn't the only example where we see this. I'm often contacted by the media for some example or another where people kind of recognize this sort of a disjunction or asymmetry, for example, in gifts to physicians from pharmaceutical representatives. Many people worry that doctors will be biased by these gifts. A little pen that says Paxil on it will get them to prescribe Paxil. And what's interesting here is that doctors, again, think that it's ludicrous that they would possibly be affected by these gifts. They say, that's what you pay me for is to be a doctor, to put my patient first, and of course that's why I am a doctor, otherwise why would I have gone into the profession? Of course I wouldn't be affected by this bias, but they readily admit that other doctors are. So even the doctors themselves see this bias in the physicians around them, just not in themselves. Another example, media junkets. So a Boston Globe reporter contacted me recently about the fact that journalists are often paid to go on these very nice trips to far-flung places, various countries in the Middle East, and they get a nice tour of the place, and it's all expenses paid. It can be quite lavish. Journalists generally think that this isn't a problem, that exactly what they do for a living is to do objective reporting, and so they can take the trip and report objectively at the end of it, whereas many of their readers might be concerned that their views on the Middle East and the conflict there might actually be biased by who paid for their trip. So here's a case of reporters believing that they won't be susceptible to a sort of a self-interest bias, just because you paid me, I'm not going to write a better story. And again, our assumption here also is that why might they be biased? Well, we assume that the person who's paying for their trip, or the nation that's paying for their trip, has its own ideological biases that they're going to try to be teaching this person, giving the person sort of a one-sided view of the conflict. So thanks for coming, let us show you how it really is, and the way that we're going to show you how it really is going to be very one-sided. So you'll come out with the view that we want. So again, another case of this asymmetry that I've sometimes referred to as the bias blind spot. Really, it's just an asymmetry in perceptions of bias. We tend to see bias in others, not so much in ourselves. I call it a blind spot just because it's a case where there's something sort of that we see all these different places around us, but there's one particular place, or at least one particular place where we tend not to see it, and that is in ourselves. So in first thinking about this idea, we noticed that there had been studies done by other researchers looking at particular cases where people might be blind to particular biases in themselves. So for example, Jeffrey Cohen just presented a study, and he didn't go into all of the measures in that study, but one of the things that they found was that at the same time that people showed this sort of a sexist bias in their hiring decisions, people weren't aware that they showed that bias. So they denied having shown that bias when asked. No, I certainly wasn't biased in choosing the candidate. Actually, the more they said that, the more biased they were, which is sort of an interesting finding. Another interesting example of people not recognizing their own bias, work by Linda Babcock and colleagues, where they assigned people in advance of reading the facts about a case, a legal case, they assigned them to either be representing the plaintiff or representing the defense, and then they had them read the facts of the case. And what happened was that people came to think that whichever side they were representing was right. And this wasn't just like some intentional thing, well, if I'm going to represent them, I better come to believe they're right. They really did believe that that side was right. And the way that we know that they really believed it was that if you asked them what a neutral outside person, like a judge, would think, they said, oh, they would side with me. My side's right. So they were completely unaware of the fact that their interpretation of the case was biased by whichever side they happened to be on. And as someone who's done some legal consulting, I can say I've seen this happen many times, and it's one of the reasons why having mock juries can sometimes be helpful. So these are cases of people's blindness to bias in themselves. There's sort of the flip side of this, which is a number of studies have shown that people tend to see and even exaggerate the presence of bias in others.